Um, what day is it today? Thursday? Holy shit. Week went by fast, for me anyway. How has Tiny App been? Awesome, enjoying, challenging, stressful, I imagine. Falling behind, yeah. I'm going to speak to that a little bit. So first off, today when I check the schedule, my understanding is Calgary, your sister cohort, is getting a local lecture today. Does that happen last week? Yeah, for a couple days, right? Or at least one day. So I'm still streaming. I'm still going to record the lecture as I normally do, hence this thing is on. How great does this look, right? Like I look like Britney Spears or something up here. So I'll try and include that video in the lecture notes as well. How have lectures been this week? Who have you guys had as lecturers this week? Travis, Garrett. Oh, we've had like a lot of different lecturers this week, all of whom are better than I am. So that's good. It's going to be a tough act to follow. But cool, I'll do my best. So I actually do want to talk a little bit in terms of my agenda. Let's just talk about what this lecture is about. So this lecture, as you might have seen in Compass, is less about kind of something that you'll need today to work on today's stuff. Because it's at the tail end of the introduction to HTTP and Express and all that, when I kind of thought about what this lecture should be while creating the 12-week program, I figured it should be a little bit more of what's real-world Express, real-world HTTP servers, what do they look like? And then as I delivered the lecture once before with the previous cohort, I realized that actually there's still quite a bit of merit in doing, okay, we've only spent 3 days on this stuff. Let's spend some time doing a review, recap, like reflecting on what we've learned. So actually I'd say about this lecture is about half of that, and then half looking forward. Okay, so when I did that last time, I kind of solicited some feedback, and students were like, yeah, the review stuff was like, you know, really, really useful. And yes, you spent a lot of time on it, but it was good. So I'm going to do the same thing this time, and hopefully I'll hear the same feedback, but please be honest if I did too much review or something like that, okay? And as we do review, we're going to go deep into understanding HTTP and understanding Express. So it's not just a high-level review, and hopefully you'll find that. But before we do that, I want to talk about a couple things in my housekeeping agenda here. The first one is kind of a status check. When I asked earlier how people are doing, some people said behind a little bit. I'm assuming some of you are feeling half a day to a day behind. Is that a fair assumption? Do you think that you're unique? Do you think that previous cohorts haven't felt that, or most students in previous cohorts haven't felt that? It's not. The answer is you're not. You're not special. This is very, very common, and I wanted to kind of speak to this a little bit because you know, it can feel a little overwhelming. You're in week 3. You don't really know what pacing for this week really means. And the truth is that pacing is actually different week to week. And you'll realize this kind of as you progress through our 12-week program. This is the first time you're doing like a larger project. Low Tide was pretty small in comparison. Would we agree? And it's also the first time you're doing a project that you know and you've been told is going to be evaluated. It's going to be reviewed, and you might pass or fail the evaluation. What the hell does that mean? That sounds scary. So I want to speak to that a little bit too. So first of all, pacing. If you look in Compass for today, you probably did. Did you? There's not a lot of Tiny App activities that are core to what you need to do before submitting. It's about, we've estimated around 2 to 3 hours of like wrap up before submitting Tiny App. And what's tomorrow? Fundamental Friday, which includes a test and some content that is completely unrelated to Tiny App, right? This is intentional, just like the previous 2 weeks. And I'm guessing some of you can relate to what I'm trying to say, which is you have that time to, yes, you could learn about the tree data structure in computer science. It's quite important. You need to learn that stuff ideally before you graduate. But do you need to know it for Tiny App? No. So in terms of what you're going to prioritize, if you are feeling behind a day or a half day on Tiny App, rest assured that students in the past have used some or all of Friday to catch up, right? And what commonly happens is Tiny App submissions start coming in end of day today, but majority of them come in on Friday. Just so you know, not to freak out if you're one of those people. Correct. It is not, no one's going to be like, where's your tiny app? If you're not submitting by end of day Friday, you might start getting messages about that. Because what happens is, and let me tell you about evaluation. So we have this army of alumni, actually, mostly, who've been working in the industry for X number of years and actually know Tiny App. Maybe they did the old curriculum, maybe they did the new one. And they've evaluated their fair share of projects that come in. And so they actually work on the weekend really, really hard to go through tens of projects and evaluate them, following a rubric that you can see in Compass. So they'll actually need to check out your code, they'll need to download it, run it, they'll need to look at the source code and their version of VS Code and give you feedback. The goal there is not about necessarily just, giving you a pass or a rejection on is it ready, is it what meets our standards. Yes, that's part of it. But it's to simulate that real world experience of when you go out, you submit a pull request or a change request to a code base, right? A new feature or a bug fix. You're going to go through likely rejections first until it's ready to be merged in. And there is something that's more of a soft skill around like handling what it means to get feedback on your code and not using that as a reflection of you, right? Not taking that feedback too personally, but also how do you action that, right? So they're going to look at things like, did you meet all the functional requirements, right? That's like if you missed like a small functional requirement, maybe not a rejection, but like a note. But if it's like a core functional requirement that's missing, it'll come back to you, which means on Monday, you'll have to think about Tiny App while you're also thinking about your new project that you're taking on. So things can snowball, right? Now, you don't need to spend usually a day trying to catch up with whatever you missed in Tiny App, but try to avoid that. And I just want to kind of remind you or tell you for the first time that you should think about, is this going to pass submission evaluation based on the rubric before submitting? So instead of submitting today, just because that's what Compass says, but with missing features, wait till tomorrow and have everything good and ready. Do a code review yourself. Maybe pair up and do some code reviewing. Make sure there's good comments in there. Make sure that there's good clean code in there, no dead code, good README file, all the things that we have in our Compass assignment that helps you prepare for submission. Follow that assignment carefully, because I do see that people that rush it end up then feeling more pain next week. Any questions about that? Nothing? Just scared looks? I just want to check in on Calgary. I just want to make sure I'm not... yeah, it looks like Hafiz is doing his own thing there. So that all said, we talked about Tiny App evaluation. And I talked a little bit about this lecture, so half review, half kind of what do I not know about, what do I need to know about more long term, right? So we'll talk about that a little bit. So let's spend about 15 minutes on like more Tiny App review. Like why are we building Tiny App, what's in it, what's not in it. And then we'll spend about 40 minutes on HTTP review, if that's okay. So what I'd like to start with in this lecture is, okay, I know you haven't fully completed Tiny App, and some of you are further along than others, but you could probably speak to like what you're going to be building fairly well. You have a general idea. So compared to like what you understand web application, like production level, like stuff that you actually use, what you understand real world web servers, web apps to have, where does Tiny App fall short? What does it not have? What are the things that we are not learning this week that we do need to learn or know about in order to build real world web apps, which have a lot more, obviously? So what's missing in terms of technology or important features, not features, but like important things that Tiny App doesn't have? That's a really good one to start with. As you may have read and understood, like Tiny App doesn't have a persistent database. Do we agree? You'll learn in week 5, we'll be going through persistent databases. So even next week, you're not going to be going into databases, right? but very soon we will, before your midterms. So like a SQL database or something like that, right? What else does it not have? So could it be wrong? Take a guess. I think I know what you're saying. Can you say it a little bit louder? Oh, interaction. Yeah, I agree. What do you mean by that? Yeah. So our web app is not very like UX. First of all, the UX kind of sucks, in my opinion. The user experience is quite UX is quite basic and not really something I would want to release, right? So not real world ready, let's call it. That's okay because we're not. This is our first one that we're building, right? It doesn't need to be again ready for the real world. But as part of that, another one that you also mentioned is it's not that there's no interactivity because clicking and submitting information is interactive. It's not just a website where you're just reading information. That's like zero interactivity. There is submitting of data. It's dynamic. It refreshes the data, right? But it doesn't have any client-side JavaScript. Right? There's no like on-page interactivity. That's what I assume you were talking about, right? No client-side JS. Anything else that we haven't really practiced or used that you would find if you're working on a real-world app? Yeah, exactly. We haven't deployed, right? We've just been, so no deployment. So it's really just localhost. What's the port? Like 3,000 or 8,000, whatever it is, I don't care. There's like this is our URL, right? So we don't worry about deployment and all the things that come with that, right? That's a conversation for later in bootcamp. What else? There's quite a few things. That's a good one. Automated testing is completely lacking so far in it, right? We've spent some time in it in the previous weeks, and we will continue to spend time on it, including in Tiny App, but very minimal. There's no automated testing specifically of our HTTP routes. Even by the end of Tiny App, you will not have tested, unless you're doing some stretch, you will not have tested your app.gets and app.posts with automated testing. But real-world apps, hopefully, usually, have some automated testing on their routes. Really, really good answer so far. Now, I'm going to mute the people that have already answered. I want to see more answers from other people. What else? Yep. You can't edit your own user information, as in like profile edit page. That's getting into features, and we can list a whole bunch. That's kind of an endless one. You're right that a real-world app like that would have some kind of profile edit page, but there's a lot of things missing from this app that it's too feature light, right? So I'm looking more at like technologies or languages or things like databases that are kind of missing from that learning experience for us. You're onto something. I mean, there's the marketing site that we haven't built for our Tiny App. If that's what you mean? But what the hell? Hey James. But you're onto something, which is how much CSS have you written? I don't think there's any requirement to write. Just refer to classes in Bootstrap so it doesn't look black and white like it used to actually. Previous to 12 weeks, Tiny App looked much worse than it does now. And then we said, you know what, we'll just add some Bootstrap so at least people feel good about what they're working on. And so when they put it on the resume, they don't feel too embarrassed, right? They still feel slightly embarrassed, but not too embarrassed. So there is no time intentionally spent on client-side CSS, right? You're not worrying about that. That's too much other stuff that you're going to have to learn in, again, this short amount of time. So we move that to next week. So next week's really going to be focusing on that, right? So things like responsive and all of that stuff, et cetera, we worry about there, right? We don't worry too much about here. Yes, we're using Bootstrap and some of that's baked in, but we don't have to create those kind of classes ourselves, right? Anything else? We're not really worrying about clean code, right? We're just like putting most of the things in one file. Agreed? Most things in one giant server file, right? All the routes. So we're going to talk a little bit about that at the end of the lecture. We'll talk about strategies that real-world apps take to organize when they have hundreds or thousands of routes, not just 5 or 10, right? And then the other one that's related to no deployment is we haven't even really touched HTTPS, right? We talked about it a little bit maybe yesterday when it comes to security, but there's no HTTPS. We're only doing HTTP here. And it's part of that deployment, right? We're not worrying about it right now, right? I think that's everything, unless there's something I'm forgetting myself. I mean, that's a majority of the things. There's obviously a lot more smaller details here, but that's the majority of things that are like not present or not focused on intentionally, right? Any what are the things that are actually included that you're learning so early on in week 3 that are actually used in the real world? Anything and everything. What are you learning this week while building Tiny App, as part of building Tiny App, that are actually transferable to real world applications? Did you want to know? Say that again? Oh, server side, just logic? So can you go a little bit more into detail on that? Just server side logic? You could, yeah, that's fair, but something a little bit more detailed. Yep. I would say, to elaborate, specifically we're using Node and Express. And these are not just toy things, right? These are actually used. Express is heavily used in the wild, right? So even just that part of the stack is something that is used in the real world, and therefore I don't discount it, right? You're learning Express, and you might use it on the job or on a side project or something like that. What else? Cookies, yes, thank you. Right? These are important things that we need to use in order to maintain memory of who the user is, right? That's trying to access something. More specifically, we are using signed or encrypted cookies right off the bat, or almost right off the bat. This is a security thing that we are using, and we didn't have to include that into Tiny App, but we decided to. And so you're actually going a little bit further than your typical Hello World Express application by thinking about some of those security, real world security things. In fact, how you store passwords is another example around security, right? We don't just do clear text password storage in Tiny App. What are we using? Yes, we're doing bcrypt-based hashing. This is actually one of the standards that the industry uses. It's not just bcrypt isn't some easier to use one. It's the real one that people tend to use. Whether they're doing it in Node or Rails. Even Rails has a bcrypt library that is often used. And same with many other frameworks. Anything else? Yes, exactly. So server-side rendering, while it's not the only, and these days not the most popular, it is still quite often done. And EJS is one of the many options, and is definitely a production-grade option. There's apps out in the wild that use EJS. You might inherit code that has EJS and some of these libraries that we were talking about here. So it's quite a bit, actually. If you think about everything that you've done in Tiny App, none of it's really only in the classroom. None of it's really educational only or academic only. All of it is like real-world viable. Pretty cool, right? And we try to do that. We try to maximize on teaching with things that are real world versus toy things that aren't really, so a toy language or a toy framework that isn't really used in the wild, right? Anything that I missed? Oh yes, yeah, Git and version control and GitHub, right? By the end of it, you'll have a good README as well, like documentation, right? Oh, and you'll be going through an evaluation. So you actually go through a code review process much like you would on the job, right? It's a bit more formalized. So that's pretty cool too. Damn, I'm really proud of this curriculum. No, I'm kidding. Okay, moving on. It's me just tooting my own horn, right? So let's talk about HTTP and review it a little bit. So I want to ask the question, kind of what are the most important attributes of HTTP? What do we understand HTTP? I don't care about the acronym and what it means. Talk to me about like what you understand HTTP to be in plain English. Somebody other than Tom? Ted? Should I start picking on people? Don't make me pick on people. What? So you think about the word stateless? What does that mean to you? The server does not keep state. So that's not what you said, but so this is a common response that I get. The server does not keep state. And that's actually not true, right? The server does keep track of data. Data is state. Things like users and URLs and things of that nature, right? So this is often too short of a statement, but you actually went beyond, which I like. You said it doesn't keep state about clients after it completes, I mean, I'm paraphrasing you here, after it completes each request. Something like that? Or were you saying something different? Yep. Same thing with get or post, you're right, yeah. Anything else? Does this make sense for statelessness? I can wait. So like a stateful? Yeah, that's actually a really good question. We haven't really talked about what is a stateful one, and it's hard to be like, well, what is stateless if I don't understand stateful? But you actually have done a stateful client-server implementation. Last week you worked on a particular application where there was a network connection that was longer lasting, and the server actually kept track of every single client that was connected to it long term versus request response, kind of the statelessness of HTTP, where it doesn't keep a long-term connection. I'm not giving you which project it was, but does it ring a bell? No, ISS was actually using HTTP still to make requests. So it was an example of one that's stateless as a client. The Snake game was using TCP, and we created our own protocol, you know, move up, move down, so on, which was sent over a TCP long-running connection. And so that's an example of a stateful where it knows exactly where each snake is on the board, so it can keep drawing the board correctly. And there's constant communication back and forth in terms of what the change is, right? Move up or move down or so on. That's an example of a stateful connection. And actually, web servers also use this. It's not just for games. It's very common with games, right? Multiplayer games where every player on the map needs to be known. But it's also common for things like, actually, I want to ask, what are other web apps, not non-game apps, that use like a long-running connection where you need like the server to keep track of everything and also be talking in like real time, essentially? WebSockets is the implementation, but what are some of the applications that use that stuff? Shopping website, I'd argue like a Shopify or an Amazon, doesn't really need, it just uses HTTP and that's fine. Because it's just like another web application, right? There's forms, there's that kind of stuff, and so they could be stateless. Maps potentially, if they're very interactive, yes. Another example is Slack or chat applications where you need to be constantly connected because you want to get new messages to the client. So there's a long-running connection. Right? So we know that HTTP is request response. It's not like Snake, where there's one running connection. It's actually you connect when you need something, or you connect when you need to send me something. Agreed? Requests are essentially those things. So what are the attributes of a request that are needed in order to make a valid HTTP request? There's two major things in an HTTP request. What are they? Request and a response, but I'm going to ask the same question for what makes a response. So specifically on the request, when a client, if you think about like for the browser to make a request to the server, what are the core pieces of information that make up a valid request? Very, very close, yes. Verb and path make up a request, but you're also right. Another thing, so that's like the header information, right? And then you said body, which is not always needed, because with a GET request, you might not need to send data, and so there is no real body. It's like empty potentially, but the first two are definitely required, right? So what's an example of a verb? Get, post, and so on, right? Those are the two major ones that we've used so far. An example of a path would be something like /FAQ or something like that, right? So then it knows what you're actually trying to do and where you're trying to do it, right? What makes a response? So once that request is made successfully, what comes back? What are the kind of pieces that are really, really important? Yep, status code. So something like a 200 or a 500 if something went wrong, or a 302 for a redirect, or a 400 series if there was some kind of client error like 404, right? What else? The data, right? If you're requesting something or if you're posting something, usually you get some more details about what that error code actually means. For example, with a page that you're loading, like a form to submit something, you'll get back the whole HTML for that form, right? So this would be request body, which could be HTML, it could be JSON, it could be something else, right? Now there's a whole bunch of other things, right? For example, you get a whole bunch of other headers, which include like cookies, right? Format, et cetera, right? And even here, you're also sending up headers, other headers like cookies, etc., right? With every request. But these are the kind of core ones. These two here, and these two here. Agreed? Now, the next thing I want to talk about, and this is a little bit more meaty, and this is in the context of Tiny App or some app like it. What does a traditional life cycle look like when we make a request to a very tiny app like application? I want to actually do a step-by-step, like what actually happens, and it's going to be a pretty multi-step process in terms of, something as simple as user navigates to this particular URL. What happens next? What happens in Express? Right? We're going to talk about each of those steps so we fully understand, or try to, how that whole life cycle works from an HTTP perspective, from an Express perspective, from a browser perspective, and obviously what the user sees as a result as well. So I'll start it off, but I want you guys to kind of drive it a little bit if that's okay, right? So to me, by the way, what I'm describing here is what happens when a user is trying to submit some new data, let's call it a new article, to a website. Okay, so I'll kick it off, and then we'll go from there. And again, it's going to be like the Tiny App workflow. Okay, we're not talking about a chat application or something like that. So first off, the user will navigate either by clicking a link or something like that to whatever the website is, / let's say, articles. I'm just making it up. Right? This is what they're going to see in the browser, or they're going to type it into the address bar, essentially, / articles. What happens after that? The browser makes a request, a GET request to / articles. All right. See, saying server renders is too quick. I want to go granular. But the server receives a request. Right? Now, what is the server here? Right? Actually, under here, I would say specifically, Express gets that request. Right? And remember those two important parts, get and then the path. It's going to use those to figure out where to go. Right? Yeah. So Express needs to invoke the correct route. You know, we have app.get and app.post and all those routes in our app. It needs to know which one to go to. So in your mind, what do you think is actually happening? And this is maybe a little bit more of an advanced question, but what do you think is happening behind the scenes in Express? How do you think Express is implementing its ability to get you to call the right route? So a very common, you know, you've got your app.gets and so on. When do those actually run? Do they get run when a request comes in? Or are they run when you start up the server? So if you think about like node space or npm start or node space server, that's what's running the file, right? So before any request comes in, all of the app.gets have already run. So what actually happens when a request comes in? Does it rerun those? Yeah, that's a good guess. Essentially what it needs in order to actually make this go to the right place, because it needs to go to one of our callback functions, right? One of our handlers, one of our route handlers. And so conceptually, before we're talking about objects, it needs a routing table. And the table is essentially like a grid, right? It's like, okay, there's going to be a verb. Just going to switch the scene here. Or actually, yeah, it's the correct one. There's a verb. There's the URL, or like the path, right? Those are the two important things that we just wrote down that make up a request. And then there is the actual callback, exactly, where it's going to go. That's the thing, that's the code that we provide, right, in the app.get, because we write something like app.get / and then the next thing we write is the function, right? I don't know why I decided to write this so close to the edge there. Right? This is our function. This is our actual callback code. Right? This is our code. And so we might say something like, yeah, if there's a get for /URLs, this is the callback function to execute, please. And so on. In order to materialize a table in memory, as it's gone through all of the app.gets and app.posts, in order to create a table, because there's no table data structure in JavaScript, there is an object data structure. You can create an object with these things for fast lookup. Sure. Not getting into the, because that's actually more about an optimization problem in terms of fast lookup. But essentially, we can think of it as an object, right? Where there's like two things that it needs in order to actually figure out which callback to go to. So in our case, get slash articles, it'll look through this data structure and actually figure out which callback is the one to go to, or if it doesn't find any, then it figures out its kind of 404 approach, right? Does that make sense? So Express looks through its routing table to determine which callback of ours to invoke. And then what happens? Hopefully it finds that callback. Yep, sorry. That's a really, really good question. So the question about middleware, which hopefully was discussed probably at a high level, is something that I have in my agenda to talk about. So what we're going to do is we're going to pretend for now that middleware is not too much of a concern for us, and we're going to come back and add middleware to the whole journey, if that's okay. Because that will add too much complexity to this particular journey. So forgetting middleware, ignoring it for now, there's our kind of callback, and then it calls that, right? So the next thing is it's found the thing in the routing table, and it's going to call it. Express invokes our callback function, passing in two objects, right? We call them request and response. So far, so good? Is this kind of the right level of detail? And we're going to go further into this. Yeah, it's a good review. Now let's say that, so they are accessing slash articles, right? So we have to kind of think about what that, it's a get request. It's going to show a form page with the ability to submit or with a list of all the articles, right? Actually, I'm going to change this up a bit. Not articles. We'll say it's going to be articles new. So I'd like to grab a new article because I want to do the whole like you're submitting new data, right? Like a new URL. So what happens now that the callback is called? What's likely in our callback for dealing with articles new or URLs new? What are you pointing to? Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, so at a high level, we want to basically render the new page, right? So our server needs to render the new form page for articles. And so we're going to talk about what the parts of that are, right? How does it actually go about doing that? What's the technology that what's the technology that we are currently using for TinyApp? EJS. So our code, our callback code, includes or ends with res.render slash, let's call it articles new or something like that. Something like that, right? So this basically tells Express which engine to use, or rather which template to load using the engine. Should have put that on mute, sorry. Using the engine that we've specified. So assuming we've specified EJS, it needs to use EJS to load that template from disk. So this is actually using the FS library or something to that something like that to actually go ahead and read that file from disk. You remember the FS library that you used last week? It's using something like that to do that for us, so we don't have to use FS directly. Whoops, sorry. And then once it does that, it's actually going to load that EJS in memory, and it's going to run through it, right? Now in this case, in this particular case, let's assume there's not much dynamic content in that EJS. So it's pretty much going to result in getting that converted. So EJS converts that template into a HTML string for Express to send back. Right? This is all happening kind of automatically as part of this one line of code. And then what's the last step here that render is going to do automatically for us? It's actually going to send that over, right? So Express, after receiving that data from EJS, sends back the HTML string via HTTP, via the HTTP connection that's still open as the response, using 200 as the status code. Agreed? And then it essentially terminates that request. Right? Because HTTP is request response, the response has gone back, we're done. Right? That TCP connection has ended. Any questions so far about this? We're going to go further. But so far up to this point, any questions or confusion about this? We're okay? Okay. So now my whole journey is get, post, get. And the reason is that the user is actually going to submit now an article. So that's part 2. So maybe we'll just add, we'll keep adding to this. Yeah, we'll just do it here. User fills out the form. Let's assume they do it accurately for this scenario. There's no like errors or anything like that, okay? And then they click something like submit, or they hit enter on the form or something like that. What happens at that point? Say that again? Yeah, the browser sends a post request to the server. And I need some more details on that, because where and how and what is sent. How does the browser know, what to do there? What informs the browser to make that post request? Exactly. It looks at the form attributes, action, and method, right? And so maybe you'll see a post, and then it will see like slash articles or something like that, right? So an example would be post to slash articles, let's assume, right? It could be articles new, but generally it's actually going to be articles. Yeah, we can talk about that a little bit more when we get to talking about REST. What happens at that point? There's something actually missing. So it's going to do the post with slash articles. What else is it sending up? All the form data. So it serializes all the form data, and this is a bit of a review, you might not recall this, into a string, essentially, because ultimately HTTP is all about sending data as string. And that string is essentially a URL encoded string, right? So what it looks like is something like this. Maybe it's articles. So article would have a title equals KV is awesome. Something like that, like with spaces turned into pluses, for example. It's encoding it into a specific key value format. And then let's say there's a body field or something like that that's a text area. It will take that and turn that into another value. Right? It will look like how parameters look in URL, where it's going to join them using ampersand, and it's key equal value ampersand, key equal value ampersand. Right? And so on. Right? So that's a post request that's happening. We would see that in our network tab. What happens after that? Of course, it's a request, so server receives a post request for /articles. Again, Express looks through its routing, right, and finds the appropriate callback. In this case, it's going to be a different callback. Hopefully that's in our routing table already. So our callback is invoked, right? And in here, actually, there's some stuff that's actually happening that's middleware specific, again. But we'll just gloss over that for now and say that Express also parses that string right here and converts it into, what do we use to actually read the form data? Request.body, right? Into request.body. And it's actually not Express that's doing it, it's a middleware that's called body parser, but we'll come back to that. Right? And what's our callback likely going to do at this point? What does it need to do? It needs to store that data, right? So our callback uses that data to create a new object or record, essentially, of that article in our quote-unquote database, which we're just saying could just be an object in memory, much like our URLs database, right? It's not really a real persistent database. It's just a fake one, good enough to kind of make the app work, right? But not really work for production. So yeah, it does that. And then what will it do upon a successful, this is a successful attempt, not a failed attempt. So what do we expect to happen in an ideal world when there's a successful form submission to TinyApp? What does TinyApp do when it gets the form submission for a new URL? Exactly. Our callback does not use EJS, but instead responds with a redirect using res.redirect, right? So that's a 302, I believe. There's different types of redirects. I'm not going to go into those details. There's like permanent and temporary and so on. But I believe it definitely does a temporary redirect, which is a 302. Okay. So what does that actually mean? What is actually going back to the client? Sorry? Template? Nope. Our redirect looks like this, /articles or something, right? Because we want to send them back to maybe the home page for all articles so they can see their new article published on /articles or something, right? So the response that goes back from Express is going to be a 302 status code along with, yeah. This is where there's a lot of confusion. Generally in the flow that we're working, there's actually no success message in this response. If you think about what you write in that response, it's response.redirect to /articles, right? So actually it's just a 302 with telling it to go to that page. That's it. So it actually includes a header HTTP header with many things, including the most important location. I'd like you to go here, please. It's now up to the browser and if it's behaving well, it doesn't have to, but if it's behaving well, if it's a real browser, it will have to respect that protocol and say, okay, that means I have to do a GET request now to that location. So now again, Express receives a GET now for /URLs. Oh, sorry, /articles. And so on. And then, at this point, we know what happens at the routing table. So routing happens. Callback needs to load article data from the database, right? Now, something different happens here in terms of EJS. Our EJS template is going to be showing all of the articles in a loop, right? Just like you do with all the URLs in a loop. And so here, our callback passes the article array, essentially, or object, into the articles, let's call it the articles template. So now EJS will run JavaScript that's embedded in there to create longer than what we see there, whatever that is, LIs or divs or something like that that's in our loop to actually represent each of those articles. Right? And then, of course, it sends that back, and the user sees like kind of the full list of all of the things, right? So that's kind of the full, like, I want to submit something, so I get the form, I actually submit the form, and then I'm redirected, which causes the third request, which is the GET. This is your traditional multi-page app workflow that is very common in various apps, including, many Rails apps, for example, right? Many PHP applications and so on, and Node applications. Any questions about this before we go on break? I didn't clarify that very well. That's a really good question. So here, yeah, so here we added a new object to that article, for that article, to our database, right? And our database is, in this case, in memory, right? And then we basically end that conversation by doing a redirect back to /articles, which is supposed to load, let's say, all the articles in reverse chronological format, right? What's the newest one on the top? Well, when that request comes back as another request, whether it's the same user or another user, any requests coming in after this fact, after step 11, are now going to see my article in the list of articles, probably at the very top, right? So now with the next request from the same user, when they go back to /articles, they're going to see that article on the very top, at least in this workflow. Does that make sense? Sure, yeah. That's a really good question, yeah. That's a really good thought exercise, right? And it's pretty common. It's good UX. We talked about how TinyApp has shit UX, right? How do we make it better? This is one example of like, maybe I want, when I take them back to the URLs page, I want to show, maybe I want to highlight which one they created or show a success message or something like that. So any ideas on how we would implement something like that? Let's go with a more complex one where instead of just showing a success message, we actually want to show the new article, which could be down the list, but we want to show it kind of in a different format, like highlighted or something like that. But how? Because I'm just gone to /articles, and remember that HTTP is stateless, so the client just made a completely new request to /articles, and at least in this current format, we haven't really done anything to remember which article was just created. Let's say the article ID was 500. 550 or something. How would it know to highlight article 550 on that page? Sorry, actually, there's a hand up here. Do you want to? What's your name again? Robert. Something like that could work. So Robert, right? His example, his solution is in the database itself, when you create a URL or article or whatever, add another Boolean flag in there to say like, has it been seen or not? And if it hasn't been seen, then you show it in yellow or whatever, right? And then once they click the details of that article or URL, then you mark it as seen true or something. But that'll actually affect everybody that's looking at the site because this is a Boolean that's read for everybody. But we want just this user to see the yellow thing and not everybody else, potentially is what you're saying. So how would we actually do it for just this user? Yeah, that's a good solution. Not an uncommon one where instead of just this, we actually say question mark, since those can include optional parameters in the URL. We can say, you know, highlight equals 550. Right? And then in our next request, which is /articles, we say, okay, there is an optional highlight parameter, request dot, what is it called? Request dot params, I believe, to read from the URL parameters. Request dot query, sure. I don't care about the naming, but yeah, it's one of those. You can parse out this, you can get that value, and then as you're looping through the articles that you're going to show in your table, you say, is this one the one that I'm supposed to highlight? Yes, it is. Let me add a CSS class called highlight to this one. Right? So it's only for that request. That's one option. Then there's other options like actually setting a cookie, temporary cookie, saying, please highlight 550, and then the next request will clear that cookie. So there could be that approach as well. So there's different approaches, and this is a common one as well. So you might want to actually, if you have extra time with URLs, with TinyApp, you might want to consider something like this as a stretch for yourself. We don't assign it, but it's a good one to add. It's a really good question. Any others before we go on break? There's obviously the middleware stuff that we haven't talked about, but anything of the stuff that we actually mentioned, any confusion or any details that I haven't covered? Was this useful to kind of understand what the hell we're even doing? Because sometimes you're so tunnel vision into following instructions of a tutorial or of the thing that you're trying to do that you don't zoom out and see what was the big picture, what was I actually implementing here? So that's why I like to do this as an exercise. So most of you are nodding your heads, and maybe some of you are like, I already knew this, and that's okay, right? Hopefully it's just validation as to what you already knew, right? So let's take that break. It's 11:04. I've gone a little bit over time with my review here, but I think that's okay. Because the stuff that follows this, to me, is not as important for today anyway, right? It's like optional good to know stuff, right? So let's take that break and resume in 10 minutes. What's the time right now? 5 after, essentially. So let's resume at 15 after. This is amazing.
No, you dressed up. He's our new DevHub coordinator.
Yeah. No, I'm saying, are you going to do the same thing with my cohort or no? Yeah, sure.
Okay. I'm Zoe, by the way.
Yes.
Hey.
KB, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, KB.
She's got candy at her desk. Can you say hi to her as well?
Good.
Are you doing that for just that cohort or both? Or what was that?
Just giving candy to people who dressed up.
Oh, I see.
You don't get any candy, Damn it.
There's one in the back there that just arrived, actually. He's amazing. But I do want to resume lecture as well.
Okay.
I'm doing that right now. Thanks. Okay. Welcome back. So we talked about kind of that HTTP lifecycle for that traditional request response for get, post, get again, right? Now we're going to talk more about kind of real world Express and what that looks like. One of the things that's very commonly used as a ideology, let's call it, is something called REST. And today in Compass, you actually have a reading on REST, but really everything in terms of applying REST further to TinyApp is optional. So this is kind of in that category of, it would be good to know. It's definitely very important to know as a software developer. It's not super important to know this week. I do recommend that you go and read and look at some of the articles that we have in there. And I'm going to actually send you some other ones that I found that are also really interesting. And I'm considering adding them to Compass myself as well, as stretch for students to look at. So what the hell is REST? It stands for something really, really confusing, which is representational state transfer. Okay, what the what? But if we look at, there's a bunch of articles on this stuff. One of them is by, so if I just do REST, HTTP REST, there's like a white paper on this, which I've never read, if I'm being honest. And so it was introduced by this individual who's actually quite well known in the community. It's not too long of a white paper. It's not ridiculously long. And it was introduced by Roy Thomson Fielding in 2000. And Roy Fielding is known for many things, including REST, but also he's contributed to the HTTP 1.1 specification as well. So he's actually quite involved in like making the web what it is today. And REST is a big part of what many apps use to build web applications. So we could have chosen to use REST or teach you REST fundamentally for TinyApp, but we chose to leave it for a little bit later because it's not critical. It's more of just like ideologies to make your web application more standardized, more obvious when you're looking at the code or when you're working with it. So it's more maintainable and kind of more scalable, if you will. So what the hell is it? I would say it's a set of rules or constraints in terms of how you think about HTTP and request response. So we're already kind of doing a little bit of this because one of the rules is like, you know, your routes should be defined a certain way, right? You know, you want to have get to get a list of articles. That's going to be get/articles. If you want to submit a new article, that's going to be post/articles, right? So we're already doing some of REST already. Our TinyApp is kind of half RESTful, if you will. I use the word RESTful. That's another term that's used when we're talking about web applications. How RESTful is it? Okay. But what's important to know is what it's not. It's not a new language. It's not a new full-on protocol like HTTP. It's not a framework that you're gonna like include as a library in your Express app or anything like that. It's just how you build your routes and how you build that client-server communication set of rules, right? And the one thing that people don't talk about when they introduce REST, even in the articles that I'm going to send you, is that there's the original white paper on REST. And then when web developers today talk about REST, it's actually more what is often called Rails REST, which is how the community decided to adopt REST. And Rails, which you will learn later in the program, actually pioneered and championed, kind of leaned into REST and made it mainstream. And as it did that, it kind of added its own conventions. So when web developers talk about REST, they're often confused about whether they're talking about the original white paper and what REST was originally meant to be, versus what they're really talking about often is like the Rails way of doing REST. It doesn't have to be done with Rails. It can be done with Node or PHP or whatever, but it's kind of a modern take on REST, if you will, and how it's actually implemented. So some of the things I'm telling you, like what I'm focusing on is more of this side, right? But the articles that I'm going to send you will talk about both. They'll talk about this, and they'll also talk about original REST. Okay? So let me actually go a little bit further into an example of what that would look like. So let's look at a website. Maybe let's look at something like Hacker News or its equivalent, Lobsters. How many people here know about Hacker News? Very few. It's definitely worth bookmarking. It's not the goal of this lecture isn't to introduce Hacker News, but do consider making it a daily visit for yourself. It's kind of like a subreddit, but it's a website on its own that just lists all the interesting things that hackers or developers are talking about. They're not all relevant to code. They're just generally interesting, nerdy news. A lot of it does end up talking about Node or Rails or whatever it may be that you are working with, right? Some of it's like to do with, I don't know, conferences or, oh, look at that. Somebody's talking about Snake Game. Cool. That looks familiar, eh? Anyway, I'm getting distracted. So we could look at a website like this, which is kind of like a typical Reddit type website. You can create new articles or share them rather. And you can also go into the detail page for that article and just kind of see what people are saying about it. And there's like comments for each article. So it's a fairly simple website, which is why I'm showing it, and also one that you should be looking at quite often. And every article has comments, right? The more modern version of this, which is less popular but still quite popular, is Lobster. So you might want to bookmark that one as well. Again, same idea. You can click on this link and view comments for a given article or submit comments for a given article, right? So assuming that we're using this domain, which is articles and comments, and yes, it has likes as well, like you can upvote something or like something, right? As you see here. But we're going to ignore that for now and just talk about comments and articles and that relationship. Is it fair to say that each article has many comments? Yes? And that you cannot have a comment outside of an article. There's no commenting, at least in this domain, that's allowing us to just submit comments. So what would their actual routes look like? Right? We've already talked about a site similar to this, so some of it's already answered for us. Right? Submitting or viewing all articles, those are the routes. Right? What would it look like for updating an article? Well, REST says, instead of using post, which is what we're using in TinyApp, you actually use, so instead of using post, we use put or patch, which is an HTTP verb as well, to modify an existing article with an ID, right? I jumped the gun here. To see the details of an article, it would be get articles ID. Do we agree? What would it look like to maybe click on the article that you've created and go in and click on edit? Let's assume there's an edit button, and that would take you to the page where it has the form. Yeah, it would be like, I want to see the form, so that would be like this, often. Right? You don't have to name your route edit. You don't have to add edit after the ID. You could change it up. But this is the Rails RESTful convention for how to name those routes. So it's predictable. Other developers can jump in and understand what that's saying. There's a pattern. There's a general convention to the madness, right? And then what happens when you submit that form for editing or updating an article? That's where you would submit a put or a patch instead of a post. A post could work, but REST says to use put and patch. And that's actually, again, the Rails way of doing REST that suggests that. Right? What about deleting an article? Maybe there's a delete button. Yeah. We'll get to comments very quickly, very shortly. Yeah. So I want to talk about comments as well. Because comments, you could argue, are either updating an article in a way, or they're adding something new to the database, which is a new comment, right? So we'll talk about that. But before, let's just finish up on articles. We still haven't finished up because we can retrieve all articles. We can update, we can create new articles. We can look at a specific one, the details of a specific one, and all the comments on that page. And then we can edit a given article, or at least get the form to edit an article, and then we can submit that form using this route here, right? What about deleting? Probably don't need a form to delete, so it's not going to have a get, but there is going to be a, now this is how maybe we do it, right? We do it something like this: post to /articles /id /, delete, right? Because we currently are limited to gets and posts, but in modern REST, we actually have access to put patch as well as another HTTP verb called delete. So we can actually send a delete verb, and then we don't need this anymore because it's a different verb, and the URL can be identical to other ones because really it's the combination that makes it a unique route. So this is still a unique route, and we'll go to a different callback in Express than one that shares the same path but has a different verb. Right? And then I forgot one, which is if I want to submit a new article, maybe that's on its own page. That would be articles new, right? Just like URLs new, potentially. So these are kind of very common 7 routes that Rails and other applications have when they're implementing REST. This is not the end-all be-all of REST. So I'm basically taking one implementation and showing you what that looks like. Right? Now let's talk about comments. Comments need to be created and added or appended to the list of comments for a given article. What would that look like? What would that look like? In terms of routes, should we just do /comments? If you want to post a new comment, can it be to /comments? Absolutely, nothing wrong with that. In fact, if I was to inspect this form here, let's see what they do. You know, because this is where you add a comment, right? Post a comment. There's the form. That's what they're doing. /comments. Right? Now, one of the things they're going to need to include is what is the article? They're calling it the story ID. Right? They include that as a hidden input field because each comment needs a story ID in their case, or in our case, an article ID. So I would say a better way of doing it, if it's a required thing that you need for a comment, is to say /articles / what is the article ID, and then comment. So you actually nest /comments under what the comment is for. So modern REST gets us to think about routes like this as well. The same thing with editing, right? It would be, I want to get the form, so it would be get comment ID. There's two IDs involved here, right? And this is where it's a little bit gray. Like some people will say, well, you don't really need to do that. You can just say get, like the comment ID is unique enough, so why not just do /comment/ID, right? So there's not a clear like consensus. There's just different teams will have slightly different consensus, and as long as they're consistent, that's what's important, right? And then there's another question that starts forming, which is what happens if it's like another thing, like comments have likes? So am I going to do /articles, /article ID, /comments, /ID, /likes? Like, is it just going to be a constant chain? And actually, one of the rules that most people follow is, now we only go like this level. And then if we're talking about likes on comments, it's going to start with /comments, /comment ID, /likes. We're not going to start all the way from articles. So we only keep one level in. Again, it's a general rule that's just formed in the community, not necessary. You could do 3 levels, but it becomes a bit redundant when you have unique IDs. You don't need the whole URL to be that way. Does this make sense? So it's not anything too complicated, right? There's way more to REST than what I've introduced, but I've left like some of the more technical white papery stuff out of it for now. You can read on that either this week or beyond. Okay. And one of the articles I'm going to send you, which I really like, actually by the folks at Recurse, who are awesome. It's called what RESTful actually means, and they go through kind of the constraints. They talk about statelessness really well, actually, really concisely, and then they talk about, basically they break that white paper out into more plain English to explain to developers, right? And then there's a nice video from another one. Where is it? Right here, videos REST. Oh, but I got to sign in with GitHub. So you'll have to sign in to get that access, but it's a free video that you can look at as well about REST, which is really good. Any questions about that? So this is still working with HTTP, right? We're doing what we've already done. We're just putting some convention in place. There are alternatives to REST that are becoming quite mainstream nowadays. One of them you already know of, maybe, we haven't used yet, which is WebSockets. You'll be learning WebSockets a little bit later in the program for that persistent connection for building something like a Slack chat app. So that'll actually come up in the React project. And then another one that you may have heard of that's more modern as an alternative to REST is called GraphQL. And in our program, we do not go into GraphQL. It is not a necessary thing to know about in order to be a junior developer. Many senior developers don't know GraphQL yet. But it is something to maybe add to your list of cool things that you might want to learn, or at least learn about, after you graduate the program. We do have workshops here, and some of them have been about GraphQL because it's so new and emerging. And it's kind of a different way of looking at HTTP. It still uses HTTP, but it's a very different convention than REST. And actually it's been created by Facebook, and they use it quite heavily. Cool, so we've talked about that stuff. I've got the articles that I'm going to send you. So that takes care of that. We're at 11:34, and I want to kind of switch gears and go back to talking about middleware, which came up. I want to talk about kind of what else do we have to think about in terms of building real-world Express apps or real-world apps in general. Are we ready to move on from REST and talk about that stuff? Yeah? Sweet. So, middleware in Express, or middleware in general. Express is not the only framework that has middleware. Rails is another example. So we're going to be learning 2 major frameworks, both of which use middleware. It's a very common pattern. So can somebody help me explain middleware? Don't all go at once. I know it's not super easy, but and it's okay to be wrong, or it's okay to be high level and not have all the details. Take a stab at it. What is middleware? Have you used middleware yet? Really? You have, but I'm tricking you. How have you used middleware? Body parser? Yep. What is it called? Cookie session or session cookies? I always forget. Cookie session? Morgan? Have you already used Morgan? Oh, nice. Yep. Morgan. Has anybody implemented Morgan yet? It's not required. It's not too hard, right? A couple lines of code, really. What else? I think those are the three. Well, those two are the ones that you kind of need to use, right? Is there anything I'm forgetting? I think those are the two main ones. So how are these things middleware? Like what makes them middleware? Try to take that approach maybe in terms of answering what is middleware. I don't want to give you all the answers, so I'll wait. Nice try, nice try. It sits in the middle between Express and, well, everything's kind of JavaScript in terms of what we're writing on the server side. So middle of Express, and yeah, I guess that's one way to describe it. It's sitting in the middle of the request coming in or the response going out. So I guess the client, right? Or the kind of, yeah, let's say the client and our code, right? Or our application logic. So let me actually try and explain that better by erasing this and showing a visual. Did we talk about middleware yesterday? Was that when it came up? Or it just came up in passing? Say that again? Okay. Right. Perfect. But in terms of lecture, did it come up quite extensively yesterday? Okay, so I don't maybe need to do it as much, you think? Okay, I'll take that for still go into it. So as a request comes in, just going to switch the scene here. Not exactly the best lighting though, so I don't know how visible that is. But anyway, as a request comes in from a browser or a user, right, over the internet, it hits our server, which is powered by Express, right? And so there's a whole bunch of like raw HTTP string data here. And we don't want to work with that string data and make our lives easier. So that's an example of something like body parser or cookie session. But I guess I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. But anyway, request is coming in with some data. And then at the end here, remember that we have our callback function that does like our logic for what we need to do for handling that particular request, right? But it's not the first thing that's hit. In fact, what happens is we've added a bunch of middleware before that callback to make our lives easier. So a middleware could be, when a body is sent, it's something like, a form is submitted with a field called A, and it's A equals 1 and B equals 2, right? That's the string in the request body. We don't want to have to like parse that and figure out what A is and B is by doing string manipulation. So we could implement a middleware, either our own or one that already exists, since it's such a common problem. So we'll just use an existing middleware instead of creating our own and add it so that every request will first go through this function, right? It'll go into this function, which will specifically have one responsibility. We all know that functions should ideally just have one responsibility and not try to do too many things. So this is a function that's specifically responsible for fixing this problem. So it'll take that and the body parser will just have some logic in here to turn that string into an object so that it's A:1 and B:2. Much easier for us to look up the data because we can just now say request.body. So this middleware actually creates the request.body object and it sets it to that value. If you disabled body parser, what will be the value of this if you did request.body? Since this function sets request.body, it'll actually be undefined because there's another object or property on request that actually has the string, and it's called something else. I forget what it's called, but I believe it won't be. I believe this will be undefined if you don't have body parser enabled. So it actually creates this property on the request object and sets it to be this object that it figures out by looking at this other property. Right? So it's actually like manipulating the request as it's coming in. And then maybe you have cookie parser that does something similar for cookies. Right? You might have another middleware that you've created yourself that's not one of these two, that's called something like authenticate user. Because for certain requests, or maybe for all requests, you want to make sure that their user ID cookie is set, right? Or maybe you have, for your bio application, a whole bunch of pages that are only for administrators, only for like staff, /admin, /reports, /something. And you'll say, I want to add middleware for all my admin routes to have a check to make sure that they are an admin, not just logged in, but also an admin. So you can stack a bunch of middleware, and not all of it has to be for all the routes. Some of it could be only for the admin routes, as I said. Right? And that just simplifies your code here so that you don't have to have those if statements in here. You have those if statements essentially in earlier middleware that can then decide, you know what? I'm not going to continue because they're not an admin. And just decide to respond right there, and we don't have to worry about putting those checks in here. Right? So that's a very common pattern that's used in various different frameworks. Does this make sense? Any questions about this? Make sense? So it could be built in, or it could be customized by us with our own business logic. Right? That's the main takeaway there. And the other main takeaway is that it sits in the middle of the request coming in or the response going out, and our actual final callback that handles the route. By the way, this thing is just another function in this chain of middleware. It just doesn't have anything at the end after this. So it is the one at the end, but ultimately it's still just added to this list of functions that are called when a request comes in. One that we haven't covered right now, but will come up next week as we continue to use Express, is static. So we haven't really had any client-side JavaScript or client-side CSS, so we haven't needed it. Nor have we added any images to TinyApp. But most web applications have assets, right? CSS, JavaScript, images. How will those get hosted? We haven't even looked at that problem in TinyApp. But there is a middleware that exists. Actually, it's built into Express, serving static files in Express, where we would say app.use, which is what we use to add another middleware function to our chain here. And we add a function that is built by calling express.static. And we say which folder all of our assets are in. It could be like assets or something like that. The most common name is public, because these are just publicly available files, right? And then you could have, let's say you had a kitten.jpg in there, or images/kitten.jpg. It would basically look in the public folder for that file, so that you don't have to create routes for each of those files. So very, very common. When you get to the project next week, you'll find that it uses this middleware. Or if you wanted to add custom CSS or custom client-side JavaScript, as just if you have that extra time this week, you could use this middleware to add some of those files, maybe a background image or a logo or something like that. You would add this to your project and then add the static file into the public folder. Does that make sense? I'm not going to demo it because I'm short on time. I was thinking about demoing it, but there's tutorials and stuff out there for implementing it. Is that okay? And then you've already talked about these, so I'm not going to go into them. Morgan, I was going to go into, but you already know about it, I believe, a little bit. You don't have to implement it. It's not a lot of work if you wanted to. It actually makes debugging easier for what it's worth. So you might want to consider it. Okay, with the last 10 minutes or so that I have left, I want to talk about a bigger, more common challenge, which is my app is getting big. It's not just about URLs and users. It's about like many different things. There's so many different routes. So let's bring up this example that I have that's actually still pretty small. That's just like articles, right? And let's assume that it has many other things, not just articles. Articles, comments, likes, users, admins. I don't know. Different images you can add or something like that. That would be a lot of different routes. So currently what we're doing is we're putting all those routes in our main Express app, in our main Express app file. Can we do better? Or rather, what is the problem with that? What is the problem with adding all of our routes for not just articles, but all the other resources like comments and so into this file? Yeah, it's going to be just a really long file. It's going to be hard to kind of maintain it, navigate it, because right now these are very small functions for me, but in reality they're going to be 5-10 lines of code each for each of those route handlers. So it's going to be a multi-hundred line file if I follow that pattern of just putting everything in one file. So instead I want to break things up, right? We've learned about modules since week 1 and the benefits of those in order to do that, right? So a very common thing that you could still employ in TinyApp and make your code even nicer is to break your URLs routes into a separate file and your other routes into another file. I'm going to show you how to do that. So first, let's just start up the server. Listing on port 8080. And let's go into it. Localhost 8080. 404 page, because there is no route for the home page, but there is a /articles. And when I go to /articles, what do I expect to see? Just a text thing that says list of articles. We don't care about actually simulating it to be a real app right now. That's not the goal. There we go, /articles. And then of course there's some others like /article/ID. So that ID, by the way, I'm not going to type in :ID into the URL. That's literally any kind of alphanumeric string, right? That's going to be my show page, and so on, right? Post and so on. In order to refactor this to make it more maintainable and put it across different files, what I'm going to do is use something called an express router, which will allow me to make this its own module, export that router, and then import it here. Okay? So how am I going to do that? I'm going to, in my case, I'm going to create a folder called maybe routes. And in there, I'm going to create a file for articles. And I'm going to move that code over. Right? Right away, I can see I have a problem. And that problem is, well, it's twofold. One, I've moved the routes away. So now if I was to restart my Node app, it's not going to work, right? I just want to confirm that that's true. / this thing, not supported anymore. And I need to actually now require that file. Agreed? So maybe up here. We'll call those something like article routes equals require, what am I going to require? What's my routes slash articles? Why will this not work? Exactly. This reads much like this, which sounds like it's a library, but it's not. It's a file relative to my current file. So in my current folder, look for a folder called routes, and then in there look for a file called articles. Exactly. It's a common gotcha, right? In fact, let's see how that looks without the dot. I don't really need to console log it, but let's just console log it right now and take a look at what that looks like. Let's run that server. Get that article, I'll get that error. Cannot find module routes articles. It's trying to look in the node modules directory and it can't find it. I'm going to do that instead. And now what do I expect? What do I expect to see now? Just in case you're wondering, like, I'm console logging whatever I'm importing from here, right? So you might want to look at what that file looks like. We haven't completed this file yet. So what will happen? I have to export it. So there's nothing being exported. What happens by default if you don't export something? This is kind of going back to week 1, week 2. What happens if you're requiring a file that doesn't export anything? I believe it's empty object that gets exported. But good guess. Could have been that. But there's another problem that's here that'll actually be encountered first before I even encounter that problem. And that is that this app thing is not defined in this file. So if anything, I'm going to get an error saying undefined object or whatever, app. Can't find app. That's what I expect to happen. Right? So now I need to figure out what the hell am I doing with this. So in order for this to work, we're going to use something called routing in Express. So Express router. And this is the express.router that we're going to require. So here's how it's going to work. We're going to, using modern ES6, not use const, but use var. We're going to require express just like we have in the other file. But then we're going to use a subcomponent of it called the router. And this gives us the object to which we're going to be, this is the one we're going to be exporting. And this is the one we're going to be adding routes to. Okay, so it's a collection of routes. It's a special object. And so instead of app dot, I'm going to say a router dot. Now I could have called it whatever. I could have said app, but this is not the full app. This is just a subset of the app. It's just certain routes, right? So I'm not using the word app here. So router is now being given these 4 things. And now all we're going to do, pretty simple, we're going to export that object. Right? Pretty simple. Instead of app, we are using router. And that router came from this thing built into Express. And now what that allows us to do is when we console log this here, it should actually, it's not going to error out here because we're not doing anything weird. And then in here, we can just see what that looks like. We still haven't used it yet, so we have to fix that problem. So I'm going to go back to the site and restart the server. And as soon as I restart it, in fact, I don't even need to hit any of the URLs because it's running that code as I restart it. And I console logged right away what came back from that require function. And we can see that it is an object, right? And it has a bunch of properties. Not really super useful, but interesting to see that it has like all of our routes defined. How many did we have defined? 4? So 1, 2, 3, 4. Each of them being, a specific way of handling the routes coming in. It's kind of showing us the internals. We're not that concerned with it, but it's still good to see that kind of work now. And then we're going to actually need to use it. Right now, if I go to /articles, it's still the same problem. I need to actually use these routes. And guess how you do that? App.use, sorry, where you want to actually add those routes to slash in this case, and article routes. So if I had something like admin routes, I would say maybe I want to add those to slash admin, right? So this reads much like middleware, right? App.use. So nothing new or different there. And actually I should add it after the body parser stuff, because I want body parser to run first, then I want to go to the routes. Right, and I might have this, I might have comments as a separate one, which would be its own file, and so on. Allows me to really separate out my code. Let's make sure this actually works. Starting to work again. Same behavior as before, I just moved them over, I just cleaned up my code a little bit, right? Any questions? I'm not done yet, I have 4 more minutes. I'm not fully done yet with showing you how I would use this feature. I want to add one more thing to it, but before I continue, any questions? Nothing? That was super clear. Do we understand the value proposition, like the benefit that we're getting from doing this? Our server file is just mostly a bunch of requires and creation or addition of middleware, and then creation or addition of these routes that are at the end here, all organized nicely into separate files. Now, this first parameter here, slash, is telling Express where to mount those routes, which path they're actually going to be on. So this means slash, and then under articles we see articles. It's not going to repeat the slash, it's not slash slash articles, but it's essentially saying please add these routes to the home route, to the root route. But I would argue that this is too repetitive. Articles, articles, articles. I would argue, let's take all of those and delete them and say that you are just posting to slash here, right? And then when I'm mounting the routes, I'm saying please mount all those routes to slash articles. So instead of repeating articles on the other side, I'm saying I control where they go when I actually load them up. And I only need to change it in one place. This is the exact same behavior as I had before, except I've moved the decision of what that path is from here to here. Now this is an arbitrary decision. I think most people prefer this approach, but the other one I showed you also worked, which is you just say slash here and then slash articles everywhere in the other file. Let me just make sure this works and I'm not lying to you. Again, I expect it to be slash articles, and yep, it does work. Now if I did include articles here and do the same thing here, included articles, what would happen? As a thought experiment or exercise, what do you think would happen? What would you expect before I do it? So when I refresh that page, what do I expect? Slash articles, what do I expect will happen? Show X is a fair guess, not correct, but fair guess. Anything else? Cannot get is the correct answer. Why did you say that? Well, it will just try to go to articles, which is what I've thought was the page, but the actual page is on articles, exactly, which is what I thought you meant to say. So here I am, cannot get, but turns out because I repeated in both sides, it's slash articles, right? So I've decided to put the prefix here on the first file, and it's there in the second file, right? And the same with the show page. So it's not what I intended. But maybe what I intended was, in both cases, like maybe those article routes are about what admins can do and not what the public can do. So I would say something like slash admin, and then leave the article side in here. Like I can decide how I'm going to organize that a little bit, right? Or it might be I want to say admin articles here, and then this one has no mention of articles. It just, looks like this, right? Does that make sense? Yep, question? That's a really good question. How does this work with redirects? Because what's included in a redirect? It's the path, right? It's the URL of where to go. So as long as, like, let's say after show we want to redirect. So we'd say, okay, oh, no, after show, sorry, after create, we want to redirect. We'd say res.redirect. And here, it's just the full URL of where we want the browser to go to. So we have to be aware at this point that there is maybe /admin/articles as the route, right? Or if it was just articles, it would be something like that. So here it has to be aware of the full path as that would be available in the browser. So you're thinking about this, not the folder structure or the way you've split up the files. That's not relevant when it comes to the redirect URL. It's literally what goes into the browser address bar. Right? Does that make sense? So you still have to repeat /articles there. You don't have to separate out your code in TinyApp, although it's not a lot of work. But don't try to do it if you're still feeling like I need to get yesterday's stuff done. I've got today's stuff to do still. Maybe reassess if you want to clean up your code further using these techniques, adding Morgan and doing this near the end, maybe tomorrow or something, or maybe later today before submitting the project. Okay? Any questions about any of this stuff? That's actually a really good point. If your helper is something like generate random user ID or something like that, or generate URL ID, and it's not actually going to get used here because you've moved, let's say you've moved the routes into another file that's going to actually create the URL and therefore need the function to generate its random ID, guess where you're going to be requiring that in? You're going to be requiring it in your routes file here at the top to say, I need that function here. So what's nice, it also separates all of the dependencies, and it's not like your server.js is just going to be a crap ton of requires. Only what you need in that file, right? So yeah, that's a really good question. It also allows you to separate your dependencies per route as well, such as your helper functions. For those of you who don't know what Ted is talking about, I know it's a T name. That's an assignment that you're going to get to fairly quickly. I believe it was in yesterday's work, or if it's, yeah, it was in yesterday's work, but like a little bit later on, where you create these helper modules to have some functions to be able to use. Okay, I'll leave it there. That was a lot that I covered. So I'm going to send out some extensive notes on that stuff, including everything that I've typed up here, right? It's 12:03, so I apologize for starting a little bit late. I think it was like 4 minutes late, ending 4 minutes late. But hopefully that was valuable. And good luck. And remember not to worry or get too stressed about being half a day or a day behind on the content. But do use it as a way to kind of make sure that you're getting it done, right? Because Friday will creep up on us very fast. It's tomorrow, right? Good luck. Cheers.